Hello and welcome to the Objective Music Report, the only source of objectively correct music opinions on the entire internet. Today we're going to be talking about Psychocandy by the Jesus and Mary Chain. There's often a feeling, I feel like in a lot of music reviews, you need to give a whole biography of the album you're talking about. I'm going to try and avoid that in these videos now. So all you need to know if you're unfamiliar with Jesus and Mary Chain, which you probably shouldn't be. I mean, if you're clicking on the video, you probably know who they are. But if you're not aware, they're a noise pop, like dream pop shoegaze band. Although those terms wouldn't have really existed at the time of their formation. So just an alternative rock band in terms of this record. I think they're still active today, but this album released in the 80s. It's all you need to know. I blabbered on and took longer than just explaining the biography outright. But whatever. This is a really awesome, interesting record, and I think honestly maybe the most interesting part about it is at the end of the day, it's ultimately a pop album. It's ultimately built on pop songs. They're ultimately the songs you're going to be listening to. Stripped of everything bare, just very, almost brutally simple pop songs. I mean, this should be obvious just given the first track, Just Like Honey. But by the way, this album is sequenced really, really well, just in terms of the songs that lead into each other. I'll get more to that later. But with that first track, Just Like Honey, it's very clearly an obvious pop track. I think the intro is kind of, it might be like a Be My Baby reference. I'm not really sure. That callback there is like very clearly like a popular music twee almost sort of direction. But, don't let me kid you, this album is extremely noisy as well. I think actually the approach to noise is not really replicated anywhere else. I wouldn't really say it's radical, but it's extremely straightforward. There are just tracks where there's just an explosion of sound. It just sounds like almost like an Eraserhead sequence of just industrial noise, not even particularly melodic or harmonic in any way, just pounded in front of you. And I think what makes this approach even more, brutal in your face is the fact that like there's so little time wasted. Lots of times I think in rock tracks that take this noisier direction, they have these extended passages which will eventually culminate in this massive amount of noise. This album doesn't really have any really extended passages or like very, very short bridges, maybe like a pre-chorus, but really the vehicle for directing the noise to you is the actual verses, maybe like a very particularly noisy chorus or pre-chorus or whatever. It's just like kind of always there. It's an omnipresent sort of vehicle the song is to communicate this just in your head. But that's not really to say that the dynamics are just constant noise the entire time. I think there actually is just a lot of interesting dynamics. Again, Just Like Honey, that song is like a crescendo overall, and the way it's sort of building up is subtle but ultimately like very dramatic in another sense as well. I said earlier that the usage of noise wasn't necessarily radical, but I think the way mixing is utilized on this record, particularly how different certain tracks are mixed in general compared to each other, actually genuinely is very radical. I think of Cut Dead and In a Hole, which are these very high-end oriented tracks with very, very little bass and very, very little low end. I think of these two tracks, which segue immediately into Taste of Cindy and Never Understand, which are very bass-oriented, heavy low-end tracks. And those sort of segues and those sort of different changes from track to track to track, I think help keep this album somewhat pretty organic, from songwriting that might otherwise get stale over time. I think the album avoids the kind of typical punk pitfall of sounding very, very samey by having these extremely experimental, radical mixing changes happening from track to track to track. Again, look at Just Like Honey and Sowing Seeds, and start with these similar rhythm section motifs. Look at how different these tracks are immediately contrasted by just the usage of mix in both of them. Just the different ways in which the mixes immediately contrast with one another just creates this different, interesting thing that lets you look past the fact that they borrow the same motif to start out with. Do I even need to mention how ahead of its time this record is? Just the idea and ethos of a band who's simultaneously obsessed with these like very disparaging, dark, distorted, noisy rock sounds and these otherwise blissful, sensual pop songs. That sort of combination is, it's kind of ubiquitous in a lot of independent underground music today. But at the time, that was really a new development. Obviously, certain artists had done it before, in a sense, but I think it's never been as delineated as it was right here in this moment, up until this point. I mean, even the usage of, like, the buried voice that's kind of in the background that's hard to make out the lyrics of, that's almost like a cliche today in dream pop and shoegaze and all those sorts of genres. That was, again, a genuine innovation on the part of this record. And it's honestly extremely impressive just how far ahead of its time it was today. Of course, though, I don't mean to imply that this album is just, a relic of, like, these are the first people to do it, respect them. I think it is genuinely just on its own merits, beautiful, awesome, mind-bending, whatever. It's great. Listen to it.